A very warm welcome to our Dealing with Depression workshop. My name is John and I will be your host. Before we start, just a few things I just want to run through quickly. I'm going to be using a comprehensive PowerPoint presentation, and the reason for that is that the majority of people learn visually, so it's important that they hear and see the presentation. And secondly, it also helps to keep me on track. It's quite a lot of information and we've got fairly limited time. The second thing, any tools or techniques that we're going to be discussing tonight, any practical applications, in other words, it's imperative to understand that any of those tools or techniques are in addition to and over and above any kind of treatment or therapy that anybody may be undergoing. For depression, by no means does this replace anything. It is always in addition to. The third thing, if anybody's got any questions after the presentation, you're welcome to contact me via email. I will give you my email address at the end and you can direct any questions to me and I will endeavour to answer them. The last thing, the presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be the clinical approach. So we're going to look at a definition, clinical definition of depression and some of the causes and some of the symptoms. And then the second part will be more practical application. That is where we will look at some tools and techniques how to address depression. We're going to start off with looking at a definition by the American Psychiatric Association of depression. Depression, also known as major depressive disorder, is a common and serious medical illness that negatively affects how you feel, the way you think, and how you act. Depression causes feelings of sadness and/or a loss of interest in activities once enjoyed. It can lead to a variety of emotional and physical problems and can decrease a person's ability to function at work and at home. And just want to go through some of the points being raised. It is a medical illness. It is diagnosable, in other words, and it is treatable. And we're going to look at what some of the symptoms are as I intimated. And it affects not only the way we feel, but also the way we think and our behaviors. So it's quite a comprehensive impact that it has on us, and it causes sadness and or loss of interest, and that's loss of interest is probably equally or an equally negative impact as the sadness is, because the person just doesn't feel like doing anything, so it just tends to spiral more and more into the feeling of sadness. And it can lead to emotional and physical problems, and one of the reasons being that it affects the biochemical and bioelectrical processes in the body that ultimately affects some of the bodily functions, and obviously then will have a huge impact on the person's physical and mental health. We're going to look at how depression is diagnosed according to the DSM-5, which is a document, basically a questionnaire that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illness. So we're going to look at what some of the specific symptoms are. In order to be diagnosed, the individual must be experiencing 5 or more symptoms during the same 2-week period, and at least one of the symptoms should be either depressed mood or loss of interest. So in order to be diagnosed, there is a certain number of symptoms that must be visible, and the individual must experience, and one being either feelings of depression or just listlessness and lack of interest. A lot of people actually have depression and are not aware of it. Maybe something I should have mentioned earlier on. Obviously, there's a big difference between feeling depressed sometimes and having the condition of depression. The two are very different. The first one is just I'm going through tough times and I'm thinking some negative thoughts and I'm feeling negative, I'm feeling depressed. Whereas clinical depression is a diagnosed condition that is caused by a number of factors that needs some kind of therapeutic intervention. Let's look at the symptoms. Depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. So it's not just the odd occasion where I feel down. I feel depressed, I feel in a dark space, I feel low, I feel down, I feel negative most of the time. Markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. And very often it can be a progression. Slowly but surely there's more and more of a disinterest and more of an inability to experience some pleasure or enjoyment maybe that I was able to experience previously. So slowly but surely there tends to be a spiraling into this pit of darkness. Significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain, or decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. And there are various reasons why this weight loss or weight gain can take place, and one of the main reasons being the impact on the biochemical and bioelectrical processes in the body that affect the body's metabolism, homeostasis, and it shows up differently for different people. For some people, they lose interest in food, they never feel hungry. Other people, again, are drawn more to food, and there are various reasons why different people react differently. A slowing down of thought and a reduction of physical movement. So it's literally a slowing down in thinking, in mental processes, and some people describe it as being, experiencing a fog, like the brain doesn't seem to be functioning properly, they can't think clearly, their cognitive processes seem to have slowed down, and also the physical movement, they tend to walk slowly, they tend to move slowly. And that's all part of that state of what people refer to the dark place that they're in, where they lose all interest and feel exhausted and drained most of the time. There's fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. People who suffer from depression, the condition of depression, tend to wake up exhausted and go to bed exhausted and feel tired during the day, just depleted energy, disinterest, and just feeling tired most of the time. There are feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. The person feels bad about him or herself. And one of the reasons could be because of the state that they are experiencing. They tend to be very, very hard on themselves. It's nearly impossible for them to snap out of it. So they feel bad about the behavior, and ultimately they feel bad about who they are and the fact that there must be something seriously wrong with them. And they begin to think and feel that they are not normal when they compare themselves with others. There is a diminished ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness nearly every day. Thought patterns are interrupted, or just the ability to think is also impaired. They tend to lose focus. It's very difficult to concentrate. They're very easily distracted. It's very difficult to make decisions, to make choices, because they just feel they are in this vacuum, and as I said a few times, in this dark place. There are often recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicide ideation without a specific plan, or suicide attempt, or a specific plan for committing suicide. And the reason for this would be that feeling low, that feeling negative, that feeling fatigued, that feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. And the individual starts to consider ways and means to get out of this hole, out of this pit. And very often the thought of suicide seems like a way out. And that thought can actually sometimes even bring slight sense of relief. And it can start off with ideation, as this point intimates, and from there it could slowly progress to an actual suicide attempt because of the way that the person is feeling. We're going to look at some of the causes. What are the causes, or what I prefer to call the contributing factors to depression? Abuse, in particular, early childhood abuse, adverse childhood experiences that maybe was never addressed, whether it be physical abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse. An abuse meaning a person going through an experience where they feel helpless, they feel hopeless, they feel violated, and that could be at various occasions or it could be ongoing. And that starts to affect the person because of the continued stress that they go through. And that could develop into chemical and bioelectrical impact on the brain and the body, and that could ultimately cause the symptoms and the experience of depression. Certain medications, some medications, the side effects can cause feelings of depression and can over time contribute towards more of the symptoms. So it's very important that we try and find out as much about any side effects of any medication that you may be using. And of course, it affects different people in different ways. Certain medications might not affect some people, but it's always important to be aware of whatever contraindications there may be. Conflict in relationships, where there is fighting or arguing or disagreements, a lot of uneasiness and drama and chaos, and that over time causes huge amounts of stress within the individual that could ultimately lead to depression. Death or a loss, if somebody loses a loved one, or could be a loss of a marriage, a loss of a career, can also cause huge amounts of stress for the individual and ultimately lead to depression. Serious illness, ongoing, lingering illness, where the person is experiencing very negative symptoms, they feel weak, they feel listless, and over time the feelings of helplessness and hopelessness that may develop can also contribute towards depression. Substance abuse. Obviously, substance abuse, drugs, alcohol, or any other kind of substances directly affects the brain chemistry. And when the brain chemistry balance becomes impaired, it affects the person's emotions and brain functions, and that is a major contributing factor to depression. Genetics, some people are just born with certain predispositions or certain organic impairment in the brain, for that matter, that could also have an impact on the chemical and electrical processes in the brain, and that could contribute towards depression as well. Major events, stressful times, and the longer those experiences linger, or the more it is compounded, the more the person becomes stressed. Feelings of frustration can, over time, also contribute to feelings of depression and ultimately symptoms of depression. And other personal problems, just coping mechanisms, the inability to deal with daily problems. Some people just seem to have better coping mechanisms than others, and there are various reasons for that. And some people just seem to become very overwhelmed by certain things and certain experiences and situations that they may be facing, and that could cause them to fall into a place of hopelessness and helplessness, and ultimately start to develop the symptoms of depression. However, and this is a very, very important however, everything we've spoken about up until this point are very valid. Everything is valid, everything is true, and it's important that we pay very close attention to all those factors. However, there is one major primary principle that is very important for us to understand. The primary causes for any and all conditions in our minds are bioelectrical and biochemical processes that facilitate function. And I've alluded to that before. In simple terms, my brain produces certain chemicals, and those chemicals facilitate certain electrical processes. And those electrical processes determine how the body and the brain function. Should there be a problem, either a shortage or an oversupply of certain chemicals or certain hormones or neurotransmitters, that will have an impact on the bioelectrical processes, and that in turn will affect the bodily function. So you've got this constant loop between the chemicals and the electricals, and the electrical processes create more chemicals, and the chemicals facilitate more electrical processes, and that ultimately determines how the brain and the body functions. And of course, the factors that we've mentioned, particularly amongst the causes, also play a role towards this. The primary cause for biochemical and bioelectrical processes is thought. And I want to read that again. A lot of people are not aware of this. The primary cause for biochemical and bioelectrical processes is thought. And what that means is the quality of my thinking determines which biochemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters are produced by the brain and released by the brain in various parts of the body. And those particular chemicals will have a direct impact on the bioelectrical processes in the body. And as I intimated earlier on, a shortage or oversupply of certain chemicals can have that impact. And yes, there are various factors that do play a role towards the chemical processes. Stress being probably the major factor, negative experiences, situations. However, it is imperative to understand that we do not experience any external factor directly the way that it is, but we only experience any external factor via thought processes. We think a certain way about situations. We talk to ourselves a certain way about situations, and that directly triggers the release of certain biochemicals, and that in turn activates certain bioelectrical processes, and that creates our experience. So I'm going to really, really labor this point. What that implies is that whatever treatment I may be undergoing, whatever medication I may be using to treat my depression, if I don't address my mental processes in this whole equation, it may still have a very negative impact. And what it really implies in scientific terms, if I can put it that way, is whatever medication I may be using or whatever therapeutic protocols I may be involved with, if I learn to address my thought processes, if I learn to address the stories that I'm telling myself about situations, that can either make the medication that I'm using and the therapeutic protocol more effective or less effective. I could be on the best possible available medication for depression, and if I am continuously stuck in negative thoughts, negative stories, negative narratives, that will continue to produce stress hormones that will make me feel negative, and that will actually have a negative impact on even the medication as well as any other therapeutic protocol. The opposite applies. If I can learn to address my thoughts, my stories, my narrative, to be more positive, to be more hopeful, to be more solution-oriented, that plays a huge role in contributing to the effectiveness of even the medication or whatever therapeutic protocol that I may be involved with. And it is really important to understand that. The two go hand in hand. And I call this the primary cause. My thinking remains the primary cause of my state. The primary contributing factor whether I'm able to address my depression or whether my depression deteriorates. We're going to look at feel-good neurotransmitters, all these chemicals that I'm talking about. And there are very specific neurotransmitters or chemicals that the brain releases that can help us to experience a more empowering, positive, hopeful state of mind and emotions. The four main ones we're going to look at are dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphin. These are chemicals or neurotransmitters that are produced by neurons in the brain. And the main cause or the main catalyst for the release of these chemicals, I'm going to say that again, is our thoughts, our narrative, our state of mind. Dopamine is referred to as the pleasure chemical, the enjoyment chemical. So every time you do something that you enjoy, that you find pleasurable, the brain is releasing dopamine. And the reason for that is during that time, you are thinking happy thoughts. You are thinking pleasurable thoughts. And those thoughts cause the release of dopamine and you enjoy the activity. The next one is serotonin. And serotonin is the well-being chemical, the chemical that gives me a sense of satisfaction and calmness. And again, it is a neurotransmitter that is released by the brain. And that is when we do something that is meaningful, that adds value to our lives, and particularly by the end of the day, we can look back and think, wow, that was great. That was really good. I really feel good because I've done that, or I feel good about myself having done that. And again, those are the kinds of thoughts that I'm thinking about that particular behavior. Thoughts of meaning and a sense of purpose and well-being. And that stimulates the release of serotonin in the brain, and I experience a sense of contentment or well-being. Oxytocin is the connection chemical when I am in a relationship with somebody that I care about. When I spend time with somebody that I care about, that experience triggers the release of oxytocin. And I experience the sense of connectedness, the sense of bonding, and that is also the chemical that is released during childbirth, and that helps the mother to bond with the baby. And once again, why does the brain release oxytocin during those situations? Because we're thinking thoughts about how much we enjoy being with this person, how much we appreciate them, and how much they mean to us. And that sense of connection and that sense of bonding is what releases oxytocin. We feel that the closeness with somebody. Endorphin may be slightly different. Endorphins are basically released through physical exercise and also through laughter. And endorphins is a chemical that makes us experience a sense of euphoria, a sense of happiness. And endorphins also have pain relieving properties. So they can help relieve any kind of pain or discomfort. So these four feel-good neurotransmitters are ultimately what make us feel happy. So if I experience pleasure and enjoyment, I experience satisfaction and contentment and well-being, I experience connection and closeness and bonding with somebody, and I experience a sense of euphoria and happiness because I do things like physical exercise and I laugh a lot, that indicates a sense of health and well-being physically, emotionally, and mentally. And these chemicals play a huge role with regards to my general state of mind, state of being, how I feel. And if I can find ways to help my brain produce more of these chemicals, it is a major resource for me to be able to address my depression as well. Enjoyment, contentment, connection, and feeling energetic, euphoric, and just having a lot of fun. We're going to look at, in a bit more detail, how some of these neurotransmitters actually affect very specific states that we experience. We're going to add two more to this particular collection. We're going to add noradrenaline and adrenaline. And these are both stress hormones, and the purpose of stress hormones really is when we face a challenge or a threat, the brain releases stress hormones, and the stress hormones help us to experience clarity of mind and physical energy to address whatever the situation is, whatever we need to do to move away from the threat or the danger. Noradrenaline, we are released on a fairly regular basis in the brain. And that is basically the chemical that makes us feel alive, makes us look forward to things. Adrenaline is less often released, and that is more at specific times when there is a specific threat where we need to take action. So we're going to look at some conditions and some states and how they are directly affected by these specific neurotransmitters. Schizophrenia, which is a disorder where the individual basically very often loses touch with reality, and it may translate into hearing voices and seeing things and delusions and paranoia and that kind of thing. And that is, amongst other causes, the result of an excess of dopamine within the brain. So very, very high dopamine levels, and if I can put it in very simple terms, it almost causes the brain to become overcharged, if I can put it that way, and overstimulated, and that could cause at least the symptoms of schizophrenia. Anxiety is the exact opposite, a lack of dopamine, very low levels of dopamine in the brain, and that could be the result of some of the causes that we looked at earlier on when we looked at the causes of depression. And it could also be genetic, where the brain is not able to release enough dopamine where I can enjoy pleasure and happiness, and instead I experience fear and anxiety and negativity. Happiness is the result of adequate levels of serotonin, where I feel content, I feel satisfied, I have a sense of well-being, I feel good about myself. Self-image or self-worth is also directly related to the amount of serotonin being released in my brain. So the right amounts of these chemicals constitute positive mental and emotional states. An excess or a shortage of these chemicals will constitute a problem in my emotional and my mental state. Let's look at depression. Depression is a lack of both dopamine and serotonin. And that causes the person's inability to enjoy themselves, the inability to feel good. And the body then responds to those thoughts about negativity and hopelessness and helplessness. And the person then feels listless, feels fatigued, feels stressed because of this imbalance in neurochemicals. When a person experiences love and connection, there is adequate amounts of dopamine, as well as serotonin, as well as oxytocin. So there is happiness, there's well-being, and there's connection, and that is ultimately what the feeling of love is all about. Fight or flight, when there is danger, when there is risk, is a combination of noradrenaline and adrenaline. That feeling of being alive, being focused, being alert, and the adrenaline that really causes me then to act on this threat, either by fighting or fleeing, and helps me to avoid or escape whatever risk there is. So we can see how important it is to do what we can to maintain a healthy level in these neurochemicals. Dopamine, do as much as I can to have enjoyment and pleasure, do the things that I love. Serotonin, do things that are meaningful, things that make me feel good about myself, and also my self-talk towards myself, my sense of self-worth. Oxytocin, spending time with people that I can connect with, that I can bond with, that I can feel good being around. And noradrenaline is doing things that are exciting, things I can look forward to. Adrenaline, maybe some of the more extreme sports, if you are so inclined, and that gives me the feeling of alertness and awakeness and awareness. Very, very important. We're going to look at emotions. What are emotions and what role do emotions play in depression? Dealing with depression, the number one emotion that the individual feels would be sadness, feeling low, feeling negative. What are emotions? Emotions are the result of my nervous system biochemically responding to my thought. We've looked at that, and it's worth repeating. How I think about a situation determines which biochemicals are released, and that determine how I feel about the situation. Emotions are indicators of the quality of my thoughts, my story, my narrative. Is the story that I'm telling myself about the situation that I'm facing positive or negative, hopeful or hopeless, problem-oriented or solution-oriented? The quality of the thoughts, the story, and the narrative directly determines the emotion, and my thoughts and my emotion ultimately lead to my behavior, and that determines how I then react, if I'm being proactive or reactive in the face of a challenge. We're going to look at the core emotions. Core emotions are the main emotions that we experience. Joy, and that could vary from contentment to absolute ecstasy. Anger can range from frustration to rage. Sadness can range from feeling a bit down to depression. Fear can be feeling a bit range from feeling a bit nervous to anxiety, and then the rest, hurt, guilt, and shame, and that is basically when I go beyond the previous emotions and I don't find ways and means to deal with them. It can turn into hurt, where I feel rejected, I feel isolated, I feel pushed aside, I feel guilty, I feel bad about the things I've done. I tend to beat myself up, I tend to be very hard on myself. And shame, I feel bad about myself, I feel bad about who I am. And we're going to look at how these emotions can contribute towards feelings of depression. A lot of people are strong introverts, so they find it very difficult to express the emotions, and the lack of expressing emotions can very often turn into depression. I'm going to take joy out of the equation. I'm going to look at anger in particular. Some people find it very difficult to express their anger, and it could be because they feel that with anger issues, so they are more inclined to suppress their anger, to keep it inside, and that can ultimately turn into depression, into sadness, into feelings of disappointment, feelings of worthlessness, feelings of hopelessness, feelings of helplessness, and that ultimately can turn into feelings of insecurity, feelings of anxiety, and as I said, that can turn into hurt, guilt, and shame. It is really very important, number one, to allow ourselves to feel whatever the emotion is. If I feel anger, allow the anger. If I feel sadness, allow the sadness. If I feel fear, hurt, guilt, or shame, allow those feelings. Understanding that there is something going on in my thinking at the time. I'm thinking thoughts of anger, I'm thinking thoughts of sadness, I'm thinking thoughts of fear, hurt, guilt, and shame. And that is causing a biochemical process in my body, and that translates into the emotions. And if I can find a way to allow myself to feel these emotions, and then go back to what is going on in my thinking right now. What are the thoughts that I'm thinking about? Where do these thoughts come from? Can I write about these thoughts? Can I talk to somebody about these thoughts? And I find a way to process those emotions. It is a hugely important contributing factor to avoiding getting to the stage of depression. We're going to look at some tools to help reframe our narrative, our thoughts, our story. In other words, what we can do to address the story that we're telling ourselves when we are facing a situation. And very often we may be facing a very negative situation where it is very difficult not to be negative, not to focus on the problem, not to complain, not to focus on how bad the situation is. However, that will continue to cause us to feel worse, and those ongoing negative emotions and feelings can contribute towards depression. So we're going to look at two very practical, simple tools that I can use to reframe or to change what I am telling myself or what I am thinking with regards to any situation that I may be facing. The first one is called the 10-10 communication game. And this was developed by a neuroscientist called Dr. Mark Waldman. And it's a very simple but very effective tool that I often use for myself and for my clients. And the premise behind this particular technique, or the principle behind this technique, is that when we think of a problem, we tend to use a lot of words. We tend to tell ourselves long, involved stories about how bad a situation is. For example, a friend or somebody that I thought I was having a good relationship with may, for some reason, be very unkind to me, talk very ugly or very rudely to me, and I may experience feelings of hurt. And the story in response may be, wow, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe that Chris is talking to me like this. I thought we were friends. After all these years of our friendship, after everything I've done with him, this is how he's talking to me. The disrespect he's showing me. So the story carries on, and the longer the story becomes, the more negative the story tends to become, the more stress hormones are being released, and the more negative I start to feel. And something that is imperative to understand is when I experience intense negative emotions, whether it is anger, sadness, fear, hurt, guilt, or shame, depression, or anxiety, there is a process of hypofrontality that kicks in, meaning that my brain starts to slow down with regards to my cognitive abilities. I can't think clearly, I can't think straight, I can't think of solutions, and the reason being that my brain goes into survival mode the longer I focus on the problem. So this is a simple tool that can help me to deal with it. Now, you all heard my long, complicated, negative story about how Chris hurt me. So I'm going to reframe the story, and I'm only going to use 10 fingers, and I'm going to reframe the story by using as close to 10 fingers as possible. Chris spoke very ugly to me, and I felt hurt. That's all that happened. What happens, my story is shorter, fewer negative words, less stress hormones, and I'm feeling a bit better. And when I feel a bit better, I am able to think more clearly. Now, the next challenge is to reduce the story to only 5 words and 5 fingers. Chris said something to me. That's all that happened. Chris says something to me. Chris could have been joking. Chris could have been having a bad day. Chris could have been venting. Whatever the reason may be, it might not have been as personal as I assumed it was in the beginning. So this particular technique of reframing is very powerful in helping me to change the story, reduce the level of stress hormones, reduce the intensity of the negative emotion, and I feel more empowered, and I can now address the situation. I can now ask Chris what is going on, or if it's a situation that I can let go of, I can do so. The next principle is how I can continue building more on positive thoughts. And so after using the 10-10 principle, and I'm able to reframe my thinking, and I'm slowly but surely practicing moving away from negative stories and narratives and thoughts to a bit more positive, empowering narratives and thoughts, I can now use the 17-second principle, and that implies that any thought that I hold for 17 seconds, the subconscious will add a similar thought to that. So, for example, if I have problems with self-image and self-esteem, and I break myself down and tell myself how bad I am, I can use the 10-10 principle, particularly if I maybe have done something that I feel bad about, or whatever it may be, and I can now reframe it, and I can maybe develop a mantra or an affirmation And I may, for example, instead of saying I'm stupid, I'm useless, why do I always do the wrong thing? I am learning, I am growing, I am getting better. I am learning, I am growing, I am feeling better. And the science behind this particular technique is I can hold on to the thought, I am learning, I am growing, I am getting better. For 17 seconds, the brain almost starts to redirect the thinking more in line with my affirmation or my narrative that I am focusing on, and it tends to add more positive words, more positive thoughts. A very powerful yet simple technique. So in order to address my mental and emotional state, over and above whatever treatment or therapeutic protocol that I may be undergoing, these two tools are extremely powerful to enhance whatever it is that I am doing or using as part of my treatment. And along with this is an understanding that 90% of the reason why I feel the way that I do is because there is something going on in my thinking, in my story, in my narrative that may be very negative, causing a huge biochemical or negative biochemical processing within my body and causing negative emotions and affecting my ability to think clearly, to be proactive. So using these two tools or techniques are very powerful in getting myself to a place where I am feeling less negative, more positive, less stress hormones, and the more I practice these techniques, I start to feel better. So the brain actually starts to produce more of the feel-good chemicals, and the more feel-good chemicals the brain produces, the more it clears up my cognitive processes, my cognitive abilities, and I can think even more clearly and be more proactive and more responsive and do what needs to be done. We've come to the end of our workshop, and as I said, if there are any questions or any queries, please feel free to direct them to me at john.ttklife@gmail.com, john.ttklife@gmail.com. I am also willing to let you have a free copy of the notes if you want to go back and revisit some of the principles. Or if you would like to inquire more about online coaching to learn more about some of these principles, again, you can contact me at john.ttklife@gmail.com. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I wish you an amazing journey of growth and development as you move forward in learning more tools and skills to be able to develop and live the life that you desire and deserve. God bless.